David Robie, welcome to Evening Report.
Great to see you, Selwyn.
Good to see you too. And congratulations on the pending launch of the third edition of Eyes of Fire, your book into the last voyage of the Rainbow Warrior and all of those issues that were the backdrop to what happened in Auckland, in the harbour at Marsden Wharf all those years ago, 30 years ago now. In the third edition, I note that in the front there, Bunny McDiarmid from Greenpeace, she writes in the preface, once you've seen the effects of nuclear testing with your own eyes, you can't pretend it doesn't exist. You've got to do something about it. This is what motivated and bound our small crew together in 1985. But of course, the Rainbow Warrior will forever be synonymous with the attack orchestrated by the French DGSE here in Auckland. But for you, David, I understand the story is much more than this. Can you expand on that?
Well, I think you have to put it in the context of what was happening at that time. And there was a concerted effort by the French military at all levels, and the headquarters in Paris and so on, for an assault, an all-out assault on independence movements and nuclear-free movements in the Pacific. And particularly in New Caledonia at the time, there was a massive series of assaults and assassinations, killings of political leaders like Elo Masharo and so on, which actually happened just a few months earlier in 1985.
And this was all part of the Kanak independence movement, was it?
That's right. The Kanaks were, from 1984 onwards, had a series of barricades and protests against French colonial rule. And so you had a massive build-up of the military in New Caledonia in response from the French. And at one stage there was something roughly about one soldier or one military personnel for every 24 citizens in New Caledonia. It was incredible build-up of military. The French military in New Caledonia at the time were much bigger than the New Zealand Armed Forces.
Wow, that's quite a different picture, isn't it, from perhaps what was being often reported here in New Zealand in the mainstream experience. Back at that time, we saw Francois Mitterrand, for example, in the presidency of the Republic of France. With it being a socialist government, did you expect that kind of build-up in the military would occur in the French territories in the Pacific?
No, it's quite astonishing in many respects, but you have to put it in the context that there was the rivalry between Mitterrand, who was Prime Minister, and Jacques Chirac, who was the right-wing Prime Minister. And they were contesting the political leadership, leading right up into the presidential elections, which, a couple of years later. And there's a dramatic film that was actually made by a French director around all this period and the military build-up and the repressive actions against Kanak pro-independence activists, leading with a massacre of militants in the Uvea cave crisis. And they were quite deliberately killed by soldiers in a helicopter posing as a journalist, to go along to crush the militants. And they killed most of the militants, and those who survived were tortured to death. So this was all, we have to remember that New Caledonia is our nearest neighbour in the Pacific, but there hasn't been a lot of interest, particularly in the media, in our near neighbours that don't speak English.
Mm. Now, with this at that particular time, of course, the Cold War was perhaps at its zenith in some respects relating to the arms race and all of that. Do you feel that France, being a nuclear power, was caught up in the hostilities of trying to demonstrate possession of its own kind of interests, etc., and that this was spilling out way down in the southern hemisphere in the Pacific region?
Yes, it was definitely spilling out into the region. The force to frap, the independent nuclear deterrent that France was, concentrating on at that time was imperative. Particularly, France wanted to have a very strong independent role other than the United States and also the UK and so on. And so that was critical to foreign policy. And so pro-independence movements and nuclear-free movements down in the South Pacific were seen as a considerable threat to national French sovereignty.
Yeah, and down in the Pacific too, at that time, of course, there was the nuclear testing that was taking place on French territory at the behest of the French government, obviously, and the decision making going right back to the presidency. And that enduring for quite a number of years. Mururoa Atoll in particular became obviously a household name of an atoll. It's a very tiny atoll, but here in New Zealand, it seemed like, looking back, the news was full of this type of thing. Can you talk about that because I understand, David, that you really specialised in this particular side of things, and certainly in the Pacific. Can you give us a picture of what it was like on the inside of reportage of this particular issue at that time?
Well, ironically, I got started reporting about French nuclear testing in the Pacific and French policy issues from Paris, period in Paris. In the 1970s, I worked for the news agency Agence France-Presse. And prior to that, my main interest had been in Africa, and I'd travelled very widely in Africa and so on, but ended up working with Agence France-Presse in Paris. And I started reading up about French policy in the region, and then I think I wrote my first article about nuclear testing at Mururoa from information that I gleaned while I was in Paris over a major incident in 1976 with massive contamination. Of course, in the early years it was atmospheric tests. And over a 30-year period, well, France actually originally began its nuclear testing, of course, in Algeria. And then after the War of Independence, they lost that opportunity to carry on nuclear testing there. So that's when they were forced to move to somewhere in the far-flung French territories, and of course nowhere better than French Polynesia as far as Paris was concerned. But over a 30-year period after Algeria, France conducted something like 193 tests out of 210. So virtually the vast bulk of them have been in the South Pacific, and most of those in Mururoa, but quite a few were also at another atoll nearby, Whangatofa. Somehow I got really involved in reporting about the nuclear testing from Paris, and then when I returned to New Zealand about 1979, and I was a foreign news editor on the Auckland Star, I continued that interest and went to French Polynesia several times. When I say French Polynesia, of course, the contested, particularly the Oscar Timaru's parties and so on have always maintained they want to be independent. But that's how it sort of flowed. But I found hostility most of the years that I worked reporting on nuclear-free issues and independence issues, and at one stage I actually got arrested a couple of times in the same year, actually. This was about a year after the first Eyes of Fire came out.
And when back at that time, what was compelling you as a journalist? What were you picking up as the big angles? Was it the humanitarian elements of it, or was it the ecology damage that was obviously occurring there, or was it the geopolitics, or was it a mix of all of that, David?
Well, a mix of all these, Selwyn. I guess what first motivated me was the human rights angles, and then of course I got deeper and deeper into the environmental aspects. And then, the geopolitics of it was very significant, and became very much an area that I focused on as well. And you mentioned Bunny McDermott earlier on, and her forward to the book, and how she sort of talked about, once you've seen, the results of nuclear testing face to face, you can't let it go. It becomes a really major issue. And I guess the more I reported about it, it was just so horrendous. And to think that not only France, but Britain, of course, Britain carried out nuclear tests at Christmas Island and Malden Island and so on, and Kiribati. And then, of course, you had the long period of American tests in Micronesia and the Marshall Islands, which really set the whole pace, if you like, in nuclear testing in the Pacific. And you think just the arrogance of these nuclear powers to think that they can just carry out nuclear tests over all those years without really any great thought to the consequences for indigenous populations in the region. And sadly, today, even though France ended nuclear tests in 1996, and then the issues sort of receded away from the headlines, the legacy is still there. The struggle is still carrying on for Pacific Islanders to deal with the health problems and the devastation for their communities and so on that have been left from radiation. So it's a continuing process.
So, for example, what came to pass for a lot of people were the poison that went on, basically radiation poisoning, wasn't it? You know, with the jellyfish babies, women giving birth to these strange kind of things. And Bunny McDiarmid obviously explains exactly in detail in some of the interviews that she has done around the commemoration, or the anniversary, if you want to put it that way, of 30 years since the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior. But of course, if we go back into the book, Eyes of Fire, it's the 3rd edition.
It's actually the 5th edition, Selwyn. It's the 3rd edition in New Zealand, but it was also had editions in the US and the UK, so it's had quite a history.
It's a prestigious history by the sound of it. But so the book very significantly focuses on some of these issues you've just explained there, about all sorts of things coming into alignment: the humanitarian impact, the environmental ecology impact, etc., in the Pacific, right down in our patch. And where you became an observer and a participant on board the Rainbow Warrior on its last voyage, as I understand it, David, and much of that is in your book, isn't it, in Eyes of Fire, and it explains really the backstory and also the human element of the Rongelap Atoll. Now, can you explain your enduring memories of that time, David, how you got to be on board the vessel, the Rainbow Warrior, and also that voyage to Rongelap, or what was happening there?
Yes, well, at the time I was actually freelancing, and I had my own freelance agency operating out of Auckland, covering the South Pacific. And at the time of the voyage, the Pacific voyage of the Rainbow Warrior, and this was its first mission in the Pacific. You know, most of the campaigns prior to that have been in the Atlantic and all over the world, but this was the first real mission in the Pacific. And Elaine Shaw, who was then head of Greenpeace New Zealand, which was a very small entity at that time, they had a small office in Nagle House. I'd had quite a lot to do with her writing about environmental issues and so on. And she approached me and said, look, we'd really like you to go and join the Rainbow Warrior for this voyage, because we need a journalist from this part of the world, from New Zealand, from the Southern Hemisphere, to be reporting about this.
Was that because you had already stamped your mark, David, as in different ways? We define these kind of styles of journalism in different ways. There's advocacy journalism, there's peace journalism, etc., etc. Was that because they'd identified that you understood the issues, you had invested time and professional development in those issues, and they needed somebody with that backstory, that experience to really make something of this?
Absolutely. At that time, I wouldn't have put any particular label on the style of journalism that I did. I just thought it was good journalism and solid backgrounding and contextualised journalism, which is what we like, it's what we try to seek in all forms of journalism. But I guess because I was a freelancer, I was able to devote more time into stories. And so reporting around the region, I'd go into a country and spend quite a bit of time there and do a series of articles. I wasn't into parachute journalism, you know. I really tried to blend in and really get a strong context into what was happening. So yes, Elaine recognised that I was really specialising in this area, and that so she was very keen for me particularly to go. And I knew that there are other journalists. There was a French pair of journalists. They were doing a TV series. There was a journalist from The Guardian, and there was also a Greenpeace videographer, as well as Fernando Pereira, of course, but there were a number of other media people involved. And then there was Giff Johnson, of course, who was the editor, was now the editor of the Marshall Islands Journal. And that time he was very closely connected with us and was involved at various stages during that voyage. But anyway, before that, building up to that, my first response was, wow, this will mean I have to be away for about 10 weeks or so. And I was a struggling freelancer. God, I had to really think about it, but I didn't think about it that long. You know, Elaine did a tremendous job of persuading me, and so I came to arrangements with Greenpeace, and I was able to, you know, join them in Hawaii on the Rainbow Warrior, and then travel right through the Marshall Islands, then Kiribati, Vanuatu, and then eventually back to Auckland. I actually left the Rainbow Warrior three nights before the bombing.
And can you, just before we get into that, can you describe the voyage around the Rongelap and the relocation of the people from Rongelap Atoll to a nearby atoll?
Well, it was a pretty sort of challenging assignment and a very moving and emotional one when we were actually really faced with it. Of course, there were lots of meetings on board, planning and preparing for the evacuation. But until we actually got there, I don't think any of us probably really realised just, what a huge challenge it was. An entire Pacific community leaving, they'd chosen to actually leave their atoll because of the health problems and the radiation, particularly from the Castle Bravo, massive bomb that had dusted radiation over the island and the health results of that. But for any Pacific community to leave its sort of ancestral homeland, its indigenous birthplace, the place where the entire identity of the people has been, for centuries, to do that and go to another island. This was on another atoll, Kwajalein, Island, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But it's an island called Majata, a lot smaller than Rongelap, and quite pretty. Rongelap was beautiful, absolutely stunningly beautiful. And Majata wasn't quite so. Pardon?
You describe your impressions of the beauty of the Pacific in your book. Quite an eloquent, almost a poetic observation of what you saw when you arrived there.
Yes, it was just absolutely stunning, and we were welcomed by a boatload of what they call boom-booms, which are the little runabouts, came out to greet us, and a number of women are on board this, and the signs that we love our kids and so on. A stunning welcome for a start. And then we came ashore and were welcomed. But it took about 3 days before really things started to move in actually relocating, because I guess we sort of thought, well, the people had decided they wanted to move, and their leader, their senator, Jetan Anjan, he was the person who approached Greenpeace and said, well, you've got the ship and nobody else is helping us. Can you help us and bring your ship here and help us move? And I guess we sort of thought, well, people would be in the process of dismantling their homes and so on, preparing for the actual shift. And that really hadn't progressed very much at all. And there was still a major village meeting and so on. They had decided, but of course, actually having to leave their whole, their environment behind. I mean, it was a very emotional. It was emotional for all the people in the village. It was emotional for us as well. And then finally, it was all go, and the village was being dismantled. The homes have been dismantled, and much plywood and corrugated aluminium and so on. All this was being carried out on the boom booms and the inflatables out to the Rainbow Warrior. And I remember taking photographs, particularly one photograph that I liked was the last image, I guess, of the school before that was pulled down, and all the children from the school were sitting outside, and their teacher, Eisen Tamer. And it was just, in every way we were confronted. Because it was a major operation, so we had to be very, very busy in helping people move and loading up the Rainbow Warrior and so on. But every step of the way, there was this emotional, challenge, things taking at us. I mean, I remember looking at the gravestone of Lekoi Zhangjian, who died of cancer. The first one died at the age of 18. And so everywhere you look around the village, there was this signs of the legacy from nuclear testing, and sort of responses. How could the US or any of the nuclear powers could do this? Such a terrible crime, really, against humanity.
So what you saw in the first instance was this absolute beauty in a community that was still in the process of getting there to make that final parting of the Indigenous land.
Yes.
But underneath there was this insidious radiation basically sitting there that it had got into the human way of life, if you like. And I understand that there were many of the children 10 years and under had thyroid problems and all of that type of thing, and that the
this
confidence
was all very visible. Yeah, you know, you saw many children with the, you know, it was a sick community. You could see very readily from the radioactive poisoning.
So you relocated the Rainbow Warrior and the crew, Greenpeace relocated the peoples to a nearby atoll. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes, it was about 140 kilometres away on Kwajalein, and it took 4 voyages to move the entire community of about 320 people. And now Kwajalein, I mentioned I was going to talk about that, and of course Kwajalein is a huge atoll, the largest in the Marshall Islands, in fact, really huge. And that's where the US carries out its Star Wars, you know, testing of ballistic missiles and so on, fired from California, and there's a testing range right in the middle of the Kwajalein Atoll itself, and then there's a military base there, and then there's a nearby island, or the military base is on one of the islands. Of course, you know, the atoll you have many islands ringing the coral. And Ebi is quite close to the US base, which is sort of like a dormitory island for people who are working on the military base, and that was notorious about that time that we were there, of incredible overcrowding, one of the probably the densest population centres globally. And so that was in the southern part of Kwajalein, and then right up on the northwest was Majato. And this was an unpopulated island at the time, but bearing in mind that the people from Rongelap were going there, they were able to shift there. From the ancestral people that had the island there were given permission for that to happen and so on. But it's not the same. You know, you're leaving a whole life and heritage, which in the Pacific is so fundamental. Land is everything. It's the identity is based around that. And so they were moving to this new island and to rebuild their villages and so on. And of course we were there in the early stages of rebuilding homes and shelters and so on. As I mentioned, it was a pretty island, not like the beauty of Rongelap was really stood out. And Majato was there was less water, for example. And it was a lot more of a challenge to sort of rebuild their community there. And of course, in 30 years since then, some people have actually gone back to Rongelap many years later, and there's an airstrip there because there was compensation, some compensation, not very good compensation. It's just a token, really, in a sense, for what has been lost from nuclear testing. But some of the people, younger people, have gone back to Rongelap, and some live in Ebi and some live in the capital island of Majuro. So the community is dislocated, really, and spread over a large part of the Marshall Islands.
And largely as a legacy of the nuclear testing and superpowers and the Western aligned nations, really, yes. I guess. Now, of course, at that time, the Rainbow Warrior, the crew, Greenpeace, and yourself moved into a different stage of like for you, of the voyage back to New Zealand. Understand from others who were on board, particularly Kiwis, that there was an excitement about getting home. Bunny, for example, I remember in a documentary that I did on this subject, Morality of Argument, spoke quite clearly about how exciting it was for her to finally be on a voyage back to New Zealand. She hadn't been home for quite some time. And can you explain what that voyage was like, heading down south into the deep winter of Auckland, New Zealand at that time, after being up there in the Pacific doing such obviously a wonderful thing?
Well, it's a pretty amazing voyage for me being a part of. you know, I wasn't formally part of the crew, but inevitably I was part of the crew, and I was on watches, for example, and did things just the same as anybody who's a crew member and so on. But as a journalist, I've just found this tremendous interesting sort of voyage to be on, and a great privilege to be part of the Rongelap evacuation. But you know, I certainly had shared Bunny's expectations getting back to New Zealand, because being at sea for 10 weeks was quite a long time, and although of course many breaks in the Marshall Islands and Vanuatu, so on as well, but it was nice to be coming back to Auckland, and so I was quite thrilled about coming back here as well, and just to be ashore and be at home for a while.
And of course, it wasn't too much longer before news broke that an explosion, 2 explosions had occurred on the vessel. What are your recollections now on that?
Oh, absolute shock on the night. I got phoned at home. I wasn't actually on board that night. I had been on board the evening before when there was a sort of reception on the Rainbow Warrior. Particularly a lot of Indigenous leaders from Aotearoa, New Zealand were there. So I couldn't really believe that this terrible thing had been happening, sabotage and bombing of a peaceful environmental ship. But my suspicions immediately were directed towards France, particularly in the context of what I'd been reporting for the last couple of years and many visits to New Caledonia. I thought, yes, this has got to have some connection there. And there were some very early misleading reports talking about, you know, pointing the finger. And some of these reports, they indicated, you know, or maybe the mercenaries were involved and various other things. And they were really just confusing the issue. And I wondered whether there's probably quite a lot of disinformation about that time, just sort of confusing and clouding the issues, and you know, so that it avoided the direct finger being pointed to France. But for me, from the very early point, I thought, you know, France has to be behind this.
Mm. Now, you've spoken in depth about the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior and all the consequences of that. With Eyes of Fire, I want to kind of get back toward that again at this juncture in the interview, David. With the dedication at the front of the book, you identify a number of people there who you say who opened our eyes. Can you tell us more about that? It's a fascinating indication right at the front of the book that leads people in to your account there.
Yes, well, if I may, at this point, just show you the latest Eyes of Fire, because I will make that point following from what you just said, Selwyn, a moment ago. This edition, the cover, is really focused on the nuclear-free struggle in the Pacific rather than the bombing as the previous editions did. And you mentioned the dedication, and so I had mentioned first of all Fernando Pereira, so dedicated to him, as he died tragically in the bombing attack, but also Bengt and Marie-Therese Danielson from Tahiti. Sadly, they've both passed on. They for many years were champions of the nuclear-free movement and independence movement too in Tahiti. There was Elaine Shaw, Amelia, and I mentioned Elaine before. Of course, her role in the early years with Greenpeace, I found her quite inspirational. So I was very pleased to dedicate it to her as well. Amelia Rokotavuna, she was a very strong nuclear-free campaigner in Fiji, and also Owen Wilkes, who was a tremendous campaigner in New Zealand and researcher. All these people were inspirational to me, and you know, Fernando on board as well, because like we were down in the extra sort of berths, the cabins down below, where the second bomb went off by the propeller, and so Fernando had the cabin just on the end, at the bottom of the stairway, and I had cabin bunks in both. We'd, sort of fraternised quite a lot, and because he was a photojournalist, I found him quite inspirational. I was much more of a print journalist, but I did take a lot of photographs, and so I was really quite inspired by a lot of his work.
And the legacy of the Rainbow Warrior, the journey, the relocation of the people from Rongelap, but also the bombing and the consequences to that. What can we learn, and what should we have learned? What have we learned from that whole, obviously a big part in New Zealand's history, Greenpeace's history, and history of the Pacific?
Well, I think that we came of age at that time with the bombing. Our nuclear-free policy was solidified and strengthened, and it gained popular support. There was very strong support prior to that, but I think that it gained widespread currency within New Zealand, and we sort of galvanised that position. And we gained a sense of pride in having our own sovereignty and having our own national direction as a small nation that was able to call to account big countries such as France, US and UK at that time, because it was a real shock to us, I think, as a people, that it wasn't only that France had the audacity to carry out this state-backed terrorism on our soil against a peaceful ship, but the US and UK basically didn't do a thing and stood by. And so the sheer hypocrisy of that, I think, struck a lot of New Zealanders. And also, although we have a close bond with Australia, it was rather disappointing, Australia's position at that time, because a little bit more sympathy and support from Australia would have meant that the police would have made further arrests of the crew members from the Uvea. So all this was, tremendous growing up period for us. We sort of gained, I think, political maturity, and we saw the virtues of actually being a small country that could actually make a difference. And we did make a difference. Sadly, we've probably lost something of that today, but I think, what we did gain is there. It's a legacy. I guess one of the things that I would have liked to have seen is a lot more support and interest in the Pacific region, because now that we have moved into this arena of climate change, which is so critical for our futures, our global future, but it's particularly critical for Pacific communities. And I still feel that we don't really have enough understanding and support for our greater Pacific region.
And so one of the sorry, David, one of the big issues there, obviously, for the people of the Pacific would be the definition or the legal kind of elements of climate change refugee issues, with it being identified as a legitimate part of the refugee issue. I would imagine our next generations will be confronting that.
Well, absolutely. I personally, as a journalist, am not too bothered about legal definitions. I believe, we are already in an arena of climate change refugees. We have evidence of this already a number of times, and think of the community of Taku, for example, in the Mortlocks in Papua New Guinea, a small Polynesian community that have been forced to relocate on mainland Bougainville. And the scenes, because having lived through the Rongelap evacuation and the scenes of what we actually did at that time, and through my photography and so on, so reminiscent of what I've seen. I haven't been to the Mortlocks or Taku, anything like that, but I saw Brian March's wonderful documentary, Once There Was an Island, and it told the story so compellingly and so beautifully. But these sort of scenes are going to happen more and more. And we're already seeing, the effects of climate change in the Marshall Islands, Tuvalu. And I think this is going to be a huge challenge for New Zealand to face up to, and very quickly, that we will want to take climate change refugees from the Pacific to New Zealand, and we need to have a policy around that very, very soon. I think another thing too is that there's recently in the news has been quite a discussion about the Runit dome in Inuiatak Atoll in the Marshall Islands. And of course Inuiatak and better known Bikini Atoll, the targets of most of the nuclear testing by the US. Well, in a puny sort of clean-up operation years later, there was a whole sort of deposit of the nuclear waste, sort of the slurry from nuclear waste was all dumped into a crater from one of these tests. Not lined or anything like that, just dumped into the crater and then sealed off at the top with these massive concrete slabs, more than 160 of them I think it was, sort of pieced together. Now that's all cracking open. And I'm not sure just to what extent it is, but the cracks appearing. And of course that was never meant to be more than a temporary solution. So now you've got a combination of climate change and the threat to many atolls, low-lying the atolls and the Marshall Islands as well as Kiribati, etc. And you've got the already leaching, so it's reported around. It's just called the dome. So with climate change and the leaching from nuclear testing, I just find that's a really symbolic thing about the connections between the legacy of nuclear testing and climate change today.
Now, David, you launched your book on launched the 5th edition of Eyes of Fire on Friday. Congratulations with the work that's gone into, once again, this enduring account of a very pertinent part of our history in the Pacific. Thank you for being on Evening Report. I really appreciate your time and all the best with your endeavours in the next few days.
Thanks very much, Selwyn.
Very welcome.